The clinking of glasses echoed in the opulent dining room, where the chandelier's glow illuminated the pristine tablecloth and expensive china. Laura sat quietly at one end, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her glass, observing the interaction between her father Roberto and Helena, her stepmother. Helena, radiant in a sleek crimson dress, leaned towards Roberto, her laughter tinkling like a well-rehearsed melody. "Darling, don't you think it's time to relax? You've worked so hard all these years," Helena purred, her hand resting lightly on Roberto's. Roberto chuckled, a deep, warm sound that had once filled Laura with a sense of security. Now it sounded tired, stretched thin by the years. He nodded vaguely, not meeting Helena's gaze. Laura shifted in her seat. She had seen this routine too many times to count. Helena's charm was a weapon, sharp and precise, used to wear down her father's defenses. Laura took a sip of her wine, masking her frustration. The conversation at the table turned to lighter topics: business, travel plans, and the upcoming celebration for Roberto's retirement. Yet beneath the surface, an undercurrent of tension pulsed. Helena was always angling, always strategizing, and Laura knew it. After dinner, as the guests moved to the living room, Laura found herself standing next to Roberto, near the grand piano. His face bore lines of exhaustion, but his smile was genuine as he looked at his daughter. "You've been quiet tonight," Roberto said, his voice low enough to keep their conversation private. "Just observing," Laura replied, offering a small smile. She hesitated, then asked, "Are you really ready for this? Retiring, I mean?" Roberto sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I think it's time, Laura. Time for new hands to carry the torch." He looked at her meaningfully, the weight of his words sinking in. Laura opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Helena's voice cut through the air. "Roberto! Come tell everyone about your plans for retirement," Helena called out, her tone cheerful but commanding. Roberto gave Laura an apologetic smile before moving toward the crowd. Laura stayed behind, watching as Helena effortlessly took the reins of the conversation, guiding it towards her own agenda. That night, as Laura lay awake in her room, the moonlight streaming through the window, she replayed the evening in her mind. There was no denying it anymore. Helena wasn't just a manipulative stepmother. She was a threat to everything Laura's father had built, and Laura was running out of time to act. The dining room shimmered with an understated elegance, the kind that spoke not of extravagance, but of quiet, accumulated wealth. The chandelier overhead cast a warm glow, bouncing off the polished silverware and reflecting in the tall crystal glasses lining the long mahogany table. The sound of gentle laughter and murmured conversation filled the room, but Laura sat in near silence at one end, her eyes quietly cataloguing every movement. Her father, Roberto, sat at the head of the table, as he always had. There was a time when his presence alone seemed to command attention, his voice effortlessly steering discussions and keeping the atmosphere lively. Tonight, however, he was a quieter version of himself, smiling faintly as he swirled the wine in his glass. "Hello, guys. If you like our stories and haven't subscribed yet, support our work and subscribe to the channel to help us." Seated to his right, Helena shone as the centerpiece of the evening, her crimson dress cutting through the neutral tones of the room like a warning signal Laura had long learned to heed. With a delicate flick of her hair, Helena laughed, her hand grazing Roberto's arm in a gesture that appeared casual, but was anything but. "Darling," Helena's voice floated through the room like honey, smooth and practiced. "Don't. You think it's about time you slowed down a little? You deserve it after everything you've done for the company." Her fingers lingered just a fraction too long on Roberto's sleeve. Laura's grip tightened around her glass, her knuckles whitening. This wasn't the first time Helena had broached the subject of retirement, but tonight there was a sharper edge to her words, one Laura didn't trust. Roberto chuckled softly, though his eyes flickered toward Laura for a brief moment. It was fleeting, but she caught it. "Perhaps," he replied, voice low and non-committal. Helena leaned in, undeterred. "You've built something incredible, Roberto. But even the strongest leaders know when to pass the torch. Isn't that right, Laura?" Helena's gaze drifted to the far end of the table, locking eyes with Laura. Laura's lips curved slightly, but there was no warmth behind her smile. Absolutely. But only when the time is right. Helena's eyes narrowed, but she masked it with a quick sip of her wine, the sparkle in her eyes never quite dimming. The conversation shifted, drawn away by one of the other guests, but the undercurrent of tension remained. Laura continued to observe as Helena effortlessly charmed the room, her laughter weaving seamlessly into every exchange. To anyone else, Helena was the epitome of grace, a loving wife, a supportive partner. Laura, however, saw through the veneer. Later, as dinner concluded and the guests moved toward the living room, Laura lingered near the piano, watching Roberto refill his glass at the drinks table. The lines on his face seemed deeper tonight, the weight on his shoulders more visible. "You've been awfully quiet," Roberto said softly, his voice low as Laura approached. "Just watching," Laura replied, her gaze flicking toward the other end of the room where Helena held court among the guests. "Are you really ready for this?" Roberto sighed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Maybe it's time, Laura. The company, it's a lot to manage. I'm not as young as I used to be." "That's not what I asked," Laura pressed, gently. Roberto met her gaze, his expression softening. "I trust you. You know that, don't you?" Laura felt the weight of those words settle over her, heavier than she anticipated. She nodded, but the unease gnawed at the edges of her mind. Before she could respond, Helena's voice cut across the room. "Roberto, come, darling. Tell everyone your plans for after retirement." Helena's smile was dazzling, but the sharpness in her tone was unmistakable. Laura's grip on the edge of the piano tightened. Roberto glanced at her one last time before heading toward the crowd, his footsteps slow but steady. From her corner of the room, Laura watched as Helena subtly steered the conversation, her hand occasionally brushing Roberto's shoulder, her voice a constant, persuasive whisper in his ear. Later that night, Laura stood by her bedroom window, staring out at the dark expanse of the garden. The moon hung high in the sky, bathing the house in pale light. She replayed the evening in her mind, dissecting every glance, every word Helena had spoken. There was no doubt anymore. Helena wasn't just pushing for retirement, she was positioning herself for something bigger. Laura's fingers curled around the edge of the curtain. Her father's company wasn't just a business. It was a part of their family's legacy, something Helena had no right to claim, and Laura wasn't about to let her take it. The morning sun filtered through the expansive windows of the company's headquarters, casting long shadows across the pristine floor. Laura stepped out of the elevator, heels clicking rhythmically as she walked down the corridor leading to her father's office. The hum of morning meetings filled the air, but Laura's focus was singular. Today felt different. Roberto had requested her presence early, a rarity in recent years. Her father often prided himself on handling business matters alone, rarely pulling Laura into the thick of things unless absolutely necessary. But something about Helena's lingering smile at the dinner table the night before left Laura restless. As she approached the office, Laura caught sight of Helena standing by the window, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp as they flickered over the city skyline. "Good morning," Laura greeted, keeping her tone neutral. Helena turned, her smile warm and familiar. Laura, always so punctual. She crossed the room, placing a perfectly manicured hand on Roberto's desk. "Your father and I were just discussing his future plans. Exciting times ahead." Laura's eyes instinctively searched for Roberto, finding him seated in his chair, his expression unreadable but distant. "Future plans?" Laura's gaze didn't waver. Roberto cleared his throat, adjusting the watch on his wrist. "Yes, I've been thinking about stepping back sooner than I initially anticipated." A pause hung in the air, the weight of those words sinking heavily into Laura's chest. "You're sure about that?" she asked, carefully measuring her words. Helena was quick to respond. "Of course he is. He's worked so hard, Laura. Don't you think he deserves to enjoy his life while he still can?" Laura's jaw tightened, though she maintained her composure. "I think he deserves to make that decision without being rushed." Helena's smile flickered for a brief second, but it was enough for Laura to catch. Roberto sighed. Laura, your concern is appreciated, but I've been at this for decades. I trust Helena's judgment on this. She's been by my side through it all. The words struck like a dull knife. I see, Laura said quietly, her eyes narrowing slightly. Helena circled the desk slowly, her movements calculated. It's not like you're being left out, dear. Roberto and I have been considering all possibilities. Perhaps a sale, something lucrative that could ensure stability for years to come. Laura's head snapped towards Helena, her pulse quickening. A sale? Laura's voice sharpened, betraying the calm facade she struggled to maintain. Roberto shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. It's just an option, Helena cooed, offering Laura a disarming smile. There have been offers, very attractive ones. It's smart to at least consider them, don't you think? No, Laura replied firmly, I don't. The air thickened, the polite veneer of the conversation beginning to crack. Laura, Roberto interjected softly, attempting to ease the growing tension. Let's not dismiss this so quickly. We have to think about the long term. Laura stared at her father, searching his face for the resolve he once carried effortlessly. But there was hesitation now, shadows in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Helena's voice lowered, smooth as silk. You're protective of the company, and I admire that. But don't let sentimentality cloud judgment. Businesses evolve. Perhaps it's time for this one to take a new path. Laura met Helena's gaze head-on, her voice cutting through the room like steel. Or perhaps it's time to remember why this company was built in the first place, for family. A flicker of irritation crossed Helena's face before she masked it with another smile. I'll let you two discuss this, Helena said, stepping toward the door. I wouldn't want to intrude. She paused at the threshold, glancing back with a final parting shot. But do think about it, Laura. Change is inevitable. As the door clicked shut behind her, Laura turned to Roberto, her voice softening, but firm. You can't seriously be considering selling. Roberto exhaled heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Laura, I'm tired. I built this company from the ground up, but maybe it's time to let someone else take the reins. I've given it my best. And you think Helena has the company's best interest at heart? Laura asked carefully. Roberto hesitated. She's been supportive, Laura. She's been calculating. Laura crossed the room, standing by his desk. I see what she's doing. She wants you to step aside, and once you do, she'll convince you to sell everything. This isn't about helping you retire, it's about control. Roberto looked at her for a long moment, but instead of arguing, he simply sighed. I need to think, Laura. Laura's heart sank. She left the office with a hollow sense of unease gnawing at her. As she passed through the corridor, she caught sight of Helena standing by the elevators, casually flipping through her phone. Helena looked up, their eyes locking. Leaving already? Helena's voice held a teasing lilt. Laura forced a smile. I have things to handle. Helena stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough for no one else to hear. You're a smart girl, Laura, but don't get in over your head. Laura's smile didn't falter. Funny, I was about to say the same to you. The elevator doors slid open, and Helena stepped inside, offering Laura a final glance before disappearing behind the closing doors. Laura remained still, her heart pounding in her chest. Helena had drawn her line in the sand, and now Laura knew she had to do the same. The days that followed were marked by a strange, unspoken tension that clung to the house like a fog. Laura noticed the subtle shifts, the way her father seemed quieter during meals, how Helena's presence lingered more than usual in his office. There was a rhythm to Helena's influence, slow but deliberate, like water wearing down stone. Laura watched carefully, playing the role of the dutiful daughter, while quietly calculating her next move. She knew better than to confront Helena head-on. Helena thrived in open conflict, twisting words and situations to her advantage. Instead, Laura took a different approach. Late one evening, after Roberto had retreated to his study, Laura approached him with 2 glasses of whiskey in hand. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Roberto looked up from his armchair, offering a small, tired smile. You know me too well, he said as Laura handed him the glass. I figured you could use it, Laura replied, settling into the chair opposite him. For a while, they sat, in silence, the warmth of the fire filling the space between them. Laura swirled the amber liquid in her glass, eyes fixed on the flames. Dad, you built this company with more than just money. You poured your life into it. You sacrificed time, energy, things most people wouldn't. Roberto exhaled slowly, nodding but saying nothing. I know you want to rest. I understand that. But Helena's pushing for something I don't think you truly want. Roberto's gaze drifted toward the fire, the lines on his face deepening. She just wants what's best for me, for us. Laura leaned forward, her voice soft but unwavering. She wants control, Dad. You know it as well as I do. His eyes met hers for a long moment, and for the first time in weeks, Laura saw the flicker of doubt cross his features. I'm not blind to Helena's ambitions, Roberto admitted finally, but she's been by my side through difficult times. I owe her some trust. You owe yourself clarity, Laura replied gently. The conversation drifted after that, but Laura could tell her words had planted a seed. She only hoped it would take root before it was too late. A week later, Helena made her move. Laura arrived at the company early, drawn by the unusual buzz among the staff. Conversations hushed as she passed, their gazes shifting toward the conference room where Roberto and Helena were in a private meeting with two unfamiliar businessmen. Laura's chest tightened. She didn't wait for an invitation. Pushing open the door, she stepped inside, her entrance smooth but firm. Helena's smile faltered for the briefest of moments before she recovered. Laura, Helena greeted with syrupy sweetness. I wasn't expecting you. I can see that, Laura replied, eyes flickering to Roberto. He looked visibly uncomfortable, his fingers laced tightly on the table. The two men rose politely, but Helena gestured for them to sit. These are representatives from Westbridge Holdings, Helena explained casually, as if this were any ordinary meeting. They're here to discuss potential acquisition plans, preliminary discussions, of course. Laura's heart pounded in her ears. She turned to her father. Preliminary discussions? Dad, is this what you want? Roberto hesitated, his gaze dropping to the papers spread before him. It's just an option, he said, echoing Helena's words from before. Laura's eyes narrowed. Could I have a moment alone with my father? Laura's voice was polite, but firm. Helena's smile didn't falter, but there was something colder beneath her gaze. I think it's important for us all to hear this, Helena. Roberto's voice, though soft, carried weight. Give us a moment. Helena's eyes met Laura's in silent defiance before she rose from the table. As the door clicked shut, Laura stepped closer. Dad, this isn't just about the company. This is about you. Her voice lowered, gentle but urgent. You've always told me legacy matters, that what we build isn't just for profit, it's for family. Selling to Westbridge, that erases everything you've worked for. Roberto rubbed his temples. Laura, I'll take it, she interrupted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. Let me take over. Let me protect what you've built. Roberto's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across his face. I've been here, Dad. I know the company. I know the people. I can do this. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Roberto nodded slowly. I'll think about it. Laura released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a step closer. The days passed in a blur, but Laura's mind never stopped turning. Each morning, she arrived at the office earlier than usual, immersing herself in the details of the company's operations. If she was going to stop Helena, she needed to be prepared for every angle. She began sitting in on meetings Roberto used to handle alone, subtly positioning herself as an undeniable presence within the company. Employees started coming to her directly with updates, bypassing Helena altogether. Small victories, but ones Laura knew mattered. Helena noticed. One afternoon, as Laura walked down the corridor leading to her office, Helena was waiting for her just outside the door. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed in a way that seemed casual, but her eyes told another story. You've been busy? Helena said, her smile tight. Someone has to be, Laura replied, brushing past her to unlock the door. Helena followed without invitation, shutting the door behind her with a soft click. You're making this harder than it needs. To be, Laura. Laura placed her bag on the desk, turning slowly to meet Helena's gaze. Am I? Helena stepped forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Your father is tired. He needs rest. What I'm suggesting is for his benefit. Laura crossed her arms, leaning against the desk. You mean selling the company out from under him? Helena's eyes flashed with irritation, but she masked it quickly. Selling isn't betrayal. It's practical. And if you weren't so blinded by sentimentality, you'd see that. Laura's gaze didn't waver. I see plenty. A brief silence settled between them, the tension palpable. I know what you're doing, Laura continued, her voice steady. But understand this, I won't let you manipulate him into something he'll regret. Helena took a step back, her smile returning but colder now. You think you're the only one protecting him, but sometimes protection means letting go, Laura. I wonder if you'll realize that before it's too late. Without waiting for a response, Helena turned and left the office, leaving Laura alone with the weight of her words. Later that evening, Laura returned home to find Roberto in his study, papers spread across his desk. He looked up as she entered, exhaustion clear in his eyes. You're working late, Laura said softly, approaching the desk. Roberto smiled. Faintly. Old habits die hard. Laura hesitated for a moment before taking a seat across from him. Dad, do you really want to sell the company? Roberto's smile faded, his gaze dropping to the documents in front of him. I don't know, he admitted quietly. Part of me feels ready, but the other part... I built this place from nothing. It's hard to let go. You don't have to, Laura said firmly. Let me handle it. I can take the lead, keep the company in the family. Isn't that what you wanted? Roberto met her gaze, his expression softening. It is. But Helena thinks about what's best for her, Laura interrupted gently. Not for you. Not for the company. A heavy silence settled over the room. Roberto leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. I trust you, Laura, he said finally, his voice low but resolute. I've always trusted you. Relief flooded Laura's chest, but before she could say more, Helena's voice called from down the hall. Roberto? Laura straightened, watching as Helena entered the study, eyes flickering briefly to Laura before settling on Roberto. Everything all right? Helena asked, her tone light but probing. Roberto glanced at Laura, then back at Helena. Yes? We were just discussing company matters. Helena's smile faltered for a split second. I see, she replied smoothly. Well, don't stay up too late. You need rest. Roberto nodded, but Laura caught the faint flicker of discomfort in his eyes. Helena lingered for a moment longer before leaving the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. As soon as she was gone, Roberto let out a slow breath. She's not going to stop, Laura said quietly. Roberto offered a tired smile. Neither. Will you, I suspect? Laura returned his smile. No, I won't. The following morning, Laura walked into the office and found an envelope on her desk. The Westbridge Holdings logo stared back at her in bold letters. Her stomach twisted as she opened it, revealing a finalized acquisition offer. She didn't need to read the details to know who had pushed this forward. Helena was accelerating the process. Laura's eyes hardened as she placed the papers down. The game was far from over. The envelope sat on Laura's desk like a warning, but she didn't let it intimidate her. She knew Helena's tactics: escalation, pressure, creating situations that seemed inevitable. This wasn't just about the company anymore. It was a battle for influence, for the trust of Roberto, and ultimately, for the legacy he had spent decades building. Laura slipped the papers back into the envelope and tucked them into her drawer. She wasn't going to play Helena's game. Not yet. Instead, she left her office and crossed the floor to the corner where Roberto's personal assistant, Anna, was typing furiously at her desk. Anna glanced up and smiled. Good morning, Laura, Anna greeted, though her eyes carried a flicker of concern. Anna, I need a favor, Laura said, lowering her voice slightly. Can you pull the latest financial reports and pending contracts? Everything my father hasn't had the chance to review yet. Anna paused, eyeing Laura carefully. Is this about the Westbridge deal? Anna asked, voice soft but direct. Laura smiled faintly. Anna had been with the company long enough to understand the undercurrents. I just want to stay ahead, Laura replied. If anything's happening behind the scenes, I need to know. Anna nodded, already gathering the necessary files. You're doing the right thing, Anna added quietly, as she handed Laura the stack of documents. Your father needs someone watching out for him. Laura accepted the files with a grateful nod. That afternoon, Laura scheduled a private meeting with the company's board of directors. It was a risky move. Helena had worked hard to build rapport with many of them, especially in Roberto's absence. But Laura wasn't willing to let that sway her. When she entered the boardroom, the air felt thick with curiosity. Several directors exchanged glances, clearly wondering why Laura had called them together without her father. I appreciate you all taking the time to meet with me, Laura began, placing the files carefully on the table. I'll keep this brief. I know there have been ongoing discussions about potential acquisitions and restructuring. I wanted to clarify my stance. The door opened suddenly. Helena stepped inside, her smile polite but unmistakably sharp. I wasn't aware there was a meeting, Helena said, feigning surprise. Laura's grip tightened on the edge of the table, but she didn't let it show. It was last minute, Laura replied smoothly. I thought it best to speak with the board directly. Helena took a seat at the far end of the table, folding her hands delicately in front of her. Please continue. Laura met the gazes of the board members, feeling their attention split between her and Helena. She took a breath and pressed on. I know there are acquisition offers circulating, Laura continued, but I want to make something clear. My father's company isn't for sale. Not now, not in the near future. A quiet murmur spread across the room, a ripple of uncertainty. Helena leaned forward, her tone light but laced with implication. Laura, I understand your attachment to the company, but we need to consider what's best for Roberto. His health, his peace of mind. Laura's eyes narrowed slightly. What's best for Roberto is preserving what he's built, Laura countered. And he's more than capable of making that decision himself. One of the senior directors, an older gentleman named Victor, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Laura, Victor began carefully, Roberto has shown interest in stepping back. If Westbridge or other buyers offer attractive terms, shouldn't we at least consider it? Laura glanced at Helena, who sat quietly watching the conversation unfold with the satisfaction of someone who had laid the groundwork long before this moment. We can consider offers, Laura allowed, keeping her voice even. But that's all they are, offers. My father has not agreed to any deal, and I'll remind everyone here that until he does, nothing moves forward. Victor exchanged looks with the other directors, but ultimately nodded in reluctant agreement. Helena's smile thinned. I appreciate your dedication, Laura, Helena said as the board members began gathering their things. But don't let pride cloud judgment. Sometimes letting go is the best way to honor what someone has built. Laura rose from her seat as the directors filed out. She waited until the room was empty, save for Helena. Is that what you tell yourself? Laura asked quietly, eyes locking with Helena's. Helena's expression didn't shift, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I tell myself that progress is inevitable, Helena replied. You can either guide it or be left behind. Laura stepped closer, lowering her voice. You underestimate me, Laura said calmly, but that's your first mistake. I'm not going to let you dismantle my father's life's work. Helena tilted her head slightly, as if sizing Laura up. Then I guess we'll see who's stronger, Helena replied, turning on her heel and leaving the room without another word. Laura stood alone in the empty boardroom, the weight of the confrontation settling over her shoulders. She had made her position clear. Now she just needed to ensure Roberto understood that his trust, his legacy, belonged in her hands. The house was quiet that evening, save for the faint crackling of the fireplace and the distant hum of Helena's voice. Drifting from the kitchen, Laura sat in the study with Roberto, papers spread across the desk between them. The whiskey glasses were untouched, a rare sight during their late-night conversations. Roberto leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the documents Laura had brought from the office. His brow furrowed slightly as he flipped through the pages. "I didn't realize these acquisition offers had come this far," he muttered, tapping one of the pages. Laura crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "They have, and Helena's been pushing them through quietly, hoping you wouldn't notice until it was too late." Roberto's eyes lifted to meet hers, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "She thinks she's protecting me, Laura. She's worried about my health. She's worried about control," Laura interrupted, her voice softer than her words. "You know it, Dad. Deep down, you've always known it." Roberto sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to will away the weight pressing on him. "I built this company for our family," Roberto said quietly. "It was never meant to be sold, but there are days I feel the exhaustion, the responsibility. Maybe Helena's right. Maybe it's time." Laura knelt beside his chair, placing her hand gently over his. "Look at me," she said, waiting until his tired eyes met hers. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore. Let me shoulder it with you. I've been working at your side for years. I know this company inside and out. I'm ready." Roberto studied her for a long moment, searching her face for something, perhaps the same determination he once carried in his youth. Finally, he nodded, his grip tightening slightly over her hand. "You've always been strong, Laura," he said, voice filled with quiet pride. "Maybe it's time I stop standing in your way." Laura smiled faintly, feeling a rare sense of relief. But as the door to the study creaked open, that relief faded. Helena stepped inside, her eyes immediately narrowing as she took in the sight of the documents spread across the desk. "I didn't realize we were having a family meeting," Helena said, her voice light but unmistakably laced with suspicion. Laura rose to her feet, keeping her expression neutral. "It's not a meeting," Laura replied calmly. "Just going. Over some company matters with Dad." Helena's gaze shifted to Roberto, searching his expression for any sign of hesitation. "You shouldn't stress him with this," Helena said, crossing the room slowly. "Roberto needs rest. You know, that." "I'm fine, Helena," Roberto replied, though his voice carried little weight. "Laura's just helping me catch up on things." Helena's eyes flickered toward Laura, and for a brief second, something unspoken passed between them, a silent clash of wills. "You've been very involved lately," Helena said, her tone carefully measured. "It's admirable. But Roberto and I've been handling these matters for some time now." Laura didn't flinch. "And now I'm involved too," she said simply. Helena's smile didn't falter, but Laura could see the frustration lurking beneath the surface. "I see," Helena replied, stepping closer to Roberto's side. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder, her thumb tracing small circles in a gesture meant to calm or control. "Roberto," Helena began sweetly, "we've already discussed this. Selling the company would provide security for you, for us. We could finally focus on enjoying life without all these burdens. Isn't that what you've wanted?" Roberto shifted slightly beneath her touch, his eyes darting to Laura. Laura stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "Dad, this isn't a burden. It's your life's work. You don't have to let it go to find peace." Helena's smile tightened. "Laura," she said, her voice like silk, "I know you mean well, but you can't hold on to the past forever. The company will evolve with or without us." Laura held Helena's gaze firmly. "I'm not holding on to the past," Laura replied. "I'm protecting the future." A heavy silence settled over the room, but neither woman looked away. Finally, Roberto cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "I need time to think," he said softly, pulling away from Helena's touch. "Both of you, I appreciate your concern, but this decision isn't one I can make lightly." Helena's expression barely flickered, but Laura didn't miss. The way her fingers curled slightly at her side. "Of course," Helena said smoothly. "Take all the time you need." She turned to leave, but paused at the doorway, glancing over her shoulder at Laura. "Just remember," Helena added, her voice quiet but pointed, Sometimes the hardest thing to do is let go. As the door clicked shut behind her, Laura turned back to Roberto. "You know she won't stop," Laura said quietly. Roberto exhaled deeply, nodding. "I know," he replied, "but neither will you." Laura smiled softly, but there was steel behind it. "Exactly." The next morning, Laura arrived at the office early, only to find Helena already there, standing near the glass windows of the boardroom. Westbridge's representatives sat at the table, waiting patiently. Helena turned as Laura approached, her smile sharp. "Ah, Laura," Helena said, her voice chipper. "Perfect timing. We were just about to begin the final review of the acquisition proposal." Laura's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "You can cancel that meeting," Laura replied smoothly, setting a folder down on the table. Helena arched a brow. "And why would I do that?" Laura opened the folder, revealing legal documents signed by Roberto. "Because Dad transferred the controlling shares of the company to me last night," Laura said, watching Helena's face carefully. For the first time, Helena's composure faltered. Laura leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "The company isn't for sale. Not today, not ever." Helena's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. Laura smiled. "This is my family's legacy. Now," Laura added quietly, "you're welcome to stay or you can leave, but you don't make the decisions here anymore." Helena's lips pressed into a thin line, but she gave a curt nod and stepped back. Laura watched as she left the boardroom, shoulders squared, knowing the battle wasn't over. But the war had shifted, and Laura intended to win. The air in the boardroom felt colder after Helena's departure, but Laura remained standing by the table, letting the weight of the moment settle in. The signed documents lay in front of her, a tangible reminder that the power balance had finally shifted. Yet she knew better than to celebrate too soon. Helena wouldn't retreat quietly. Laura stepped out of the boardroom, the hum of the office washing over her like white noise. Employees passed by, exchanging polite greetings, but Laura barely registered them. Her focus was singular. She needed to find Roberto. She made her way to his office, knocking softly before stepping inside. Roberto sat by the window, the morning sunlight casting long shadows across his desk. He looked up as she entered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You've been busy," Roberto said, gesturing to the stack of papers in her hand. Laura approached, setting the documents down in front of him. "It's done," she said quietly. "The controlling shares are under my name now." Roberto studied her face for a long moment before nodding. "I knew you could handle it," he said, his voice warm but tired. "I'm proud of you, Laura." Laura's chest tightened at his words. She had waited so long to hear them, but the weight of responsibility was already settling on her shoulders. "Thank you," she replied, taking a seat across from him. "But this isn't over. Helena won't let it go." Roberto's gaze drifted out the window, his expression thoughtful. "She's persistent," he admitted. "But she's also smart enough to know when she's lost." Laura wasn't convinced. Later that evening, Laura returned home to find Helena in the living room, pouring herself a glass of wine. The house was quiet, and the tension between them filled the space, like a tangible presence. Helena didn't acknowledge Laura at first, swirling the wine in her glass as if deep in thought. "You moved quickly," Helena said, finally breaking the silence. "I'll give you that." Laura leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "I did what needed to be done," Laura replied, her voice calm but firm. Helena turned, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Laura. "Do you really think this changes anything?" Helena asked, taking a slow sip of her wine. "Roberto may have signed those papers, but influence isn't something you inherit overnight." Laura's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not interested in playing games, Helena. The company isn't for sale. You can accept that or you can leave." Helena chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Oh, Laura," she said, setting the glass down on the table. "You're so much like your father, but you forget one thing. People like me don't walk away empty-handed." Laura straightened, sensing the shift in Helena's tone. "What are you saying?" Helena met Laura's gaze, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I've been by Roberto's side for years," Helena said smoothly, "and I know things. Personal things. Details that could make life very uncomfortable for him. For you." Laura's heart quickened, but she refused to let Helena see any sign of hesitation. "Is that a threat?" Laura asked quietly. Helena took another sip of wine, her expression unreadable. "It's just a reminder," Helena replied. "You may have the papers, but don't underestimate the damage I can do without them." Laura stepped forward, her eyes locked on Helena's. "I'm not afraid of you," Laura said, her voice low and steady. "And if you think you can manipulate Dad or me with empty threats, you're wrong. This ends now." Helena's smile faded, but she didn't respond. Instead, she placed the glass down carefully and walked past Laura, leaving the room without another word. Laura stood in the empty living room, her hands trembling slightly. She knew Helena wasn't bluffing. In the following days, Laura worked tirelessly to solidify her position within the company. She held meetings with key clients, reinforced alliances with trusted board members, and ensured that every department head understood that she was now in charge. Helena's presence at the office began to dwindle, but Laura wasn't naive. Helena was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. One afternoon, Anna appeared at Laura's office door, her expression tight with concern. "You need to see this," Anna said, placing a tablet in front of Laura. Laura's eyes narrowed as she read the headline flashing across the screen. "Sources claim internal turmoil at Roberto Salazar's company amid leadership transition." The article detailed rumors of unrest within the company, questioning Laura's experience and hinting at disagreements between her and Roberto. Laura exhaled slowly, setting the tablet down. "Helena," Laura muttered under her breath. Anna nodded. "It has her fingerprints all over it. What do you want to do?" Laura's mind raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "We don't respond publicly," Laura said firmly. "That's exactly what she wants. Instead, we keep moving forward. Schedule a press conference for next week. I'll handle this myself." Anna nodded and left the office. Laura leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. Helena wasn't going to stop, but neither was she. The press conference was set for the following Monday. As Laura stood before the cameras, she felt the weight of every eye in the room on her. She took a breath, steadying herself. "I know there have been rumors circulating," Laura began, her voice clear and unwavering. "But let me make one thing perfectly clear. This company is not for sale. It never was, and it never will be." The room fell silent. Laura continued, locking eyes with the journalists in front of her. "My father built this company with his own two hands, and I intend to honor that legacy. We are stronger than ever, and I am proud to lead this company into the future." As the cameras flashed and the questions poured in, Laura felt a renewed sense of resolve. Helena could try to undermine her, but Laura had something Helena never would: Roberto's trust and the unwavering belief that she belonged exactly where she was. The morning after the press conference, Laura arrived at the office early, the weight of her words still lingering in her mind. The reporters' flashes, the questions, none of it rattled her. If anything, it fueled her resolve. She knew Helena was watching. By the time she stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, the office was already buzzing. Conversations lowered as she passed by, but Laura paid no attention. She entered her office, only to find Roberto waiting for her by the window, gazing out at the city below. "You handled that well," Roberto said without turning around. Laura smiled faintly, setting her bag down. "I learned from the best." Roberto turned, his eyes softening as he took in the sight of his daughter, now firmly in control. "I never imagined things would play out like this," he admitted. "But I'm glad you stepped up." Laura crossed the room and leaned against the edge of her desk. "You built something worth protecting, Dad. I couldn't just stand by and watch it slip away." Roberto studied her for a long moment, pride, and something deeper flickering in his eyes. "You remind me so much of your mother," he said softly. Laura's throat tightened at the mention of her mother, gone for years now, but ever present in their hearts. Before she could respond, the door to her office opened, and Helena walked in unannounced, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Am I interrupting? Helena asked, her tone light but the tension unmistakable. Laura straightened, folding her arms across her chest. What do you need, Helena? Helena's eyes flickered briefly toward Roberto, but her focus remained on Laura. I thought we should talk, Helena said, ignoring Laura's pointed question. Privately. Laura glanced at Roberto, who gave her a small nod. I'll leave you two to it, he said, brushing Helena's shoulder lightly as he exited the room. As the door clicked shut behind him, Laura locked eyes with Helena. You're persistent, Laura said, breaking the silence first. Helena smiled thinly. So are you. I suppose that's why this has dragged on longer than necessary. Laura didn't respond, waiting for Helena to make her move. Helena stepped closer to the desk, running her fingers lightly along its edge as if she belonged there. You think winning over Roberto is enough to keep me out, Helena said, her voice low. But you forget. I know this company too, and I know its weak spots. Laura's eyes narrowed. Is that supposed to scare me? It should, Helena replied smoothly. Because unlike you, I'm not afraid to play dirty. Laura let out a soft breath, shaking her head. That's the difference between us, Helena. You think this is about power plays and manipulation, but this company isn't just a prize to me, it's home, it's family. Helena's smile faded slightly. And that's why you'll lose, Laura continued, stepping around the desk, until she was face to face with Helena. Because you underestimate the strength that comes from protecting something you love. Helena held her gaze, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Finally, Helena stepped back, adjusting her coat with a forced, casual air. You've made your position clear, Helena said softly. But don't expect me to disappear. Laura watched as Helena turned and left the office without another word. The door clicked shut, leaving Laura alone with the distant hum of the office beyond. That evening, Laura found Roberto sitting in the garden, his eyes fixed on the fading sunset. She stepped outside quietly, joining him on the stone bench without saying a word. For a long time they sat in silence, the cool air wrapping around them. She won't stop, Roberto said finally, breaking the quiet. Laura nodded. I know. Roberto exhaled slowly, his gaze distant. I let it go on too long. I thought, maybe she really did care about me, about us. She cared about what she could take, Laura said gently, but that's over now. Roberto glanced at her, and for the first time in months, Laura saw clarity in his eyes. I'm proud of you, he said, his voice steady. Your mother would be too. Laura smiled softly, her heart swelling at the words. They sat there until the stars began to emerge, neither of them feeling the need to say anything more. For the first time in a long while, the silence felt peaceful. The next morning, Laura arrived at the office to find Anna waiting with a stack of documents. Helena's resignation, Anna said, holding up the top sheet with a faint smile. Laura arched a brow but took the paper, scanning it quickly. She didn't say anything to me, Laura remarked, surprised. Anna shrugged. Maybe she finally realized there was nothing left to gain. Laura set the paper down, nodding to herself. Good, she said simply. It's time to move. Forward. Anna hesitated at the door, then smiled. The company's in good hands, Laura. Everyone knows it. Laura returned the smile. Thank you, Anna. I won't let them down. As Anna left the office, Laura stood by the window looking out over the city. The fight wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Helena's shadow no longer lingered over the company or her family, and as Laura watched the city below, she felt something. She hadn't in a long time. Peace. The legacy was safe and it was hers to protect. The days that followed Helena's quiet resignation felt like the calm after a long storm. Laura moved through the office with a renewed sense of purpose, her presence now fully acknowledged by everyone. The weight of responsibility hadn't lessened, but she carried it with pride, knowing she had earned her place. Sitting at her father's old desk, Laura sifted through reports and contracts, carefully navigating each decision. The company had stabilized, but there were still lingering traces of Helena's influence, small cracks that needed mending. Anna entered with a stack of documents, setting them down gently on the desk. The restructuring plan is ready, Anna said, offering Laura a brief smile. It's solid. I think you'll be pleased. Laura nodded, flipping through the pages. Good. Let's move forward with it. As Anna turned to leave, she hesitated for a moment. It's different without her here, Anna remarked softly. Laura looked up. It is. But different isn't always bad. Anna smiled. No, it's not. Once alone, Laura leaned back in her chair, gazing out at the city skyline. The company was finally hers to shape, but that realization came with a bittersweet tinge. Despite everything, Helena's departure left a strange silence in her wake. Later that evening, Laura found Roberto in the garden again, seated on the same stone bench as before. The sunset painted the sky in warm hues, casting soft shadows across the lawn. Laura approached, hands tucked into her coat pockets. You're awfully quiet tonight, she noted, sitting beside him. Roberto chuckled lightly. I'm just enjoying the peace. It's been a while since things felt simple. Laura smiled, tilting her head toward him. Helena's gone. The company's stable. I'd say you've earned that peace. Roberto's gaze lingered on the horizon. It wasn't easy letting go. Laura's voice softened. I know. But you trusted me, and I won't let you down. Roberto finally turned to her, pride evident in his eyes. You haven't. You've done more than I ever expected. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of past battles lifting just enough to let in the cool evening breeze. As Laura rose to leave, Roberto called out softly, Laura. She paused, turning back. Thank you, he said, simply. Laura's smile deepened, and for the first time in a long while she felt truly at home. A light drizzle tapped against the glass windows of the office as Laura stood by the boardroom, watching the rain paint faint lines down the city skyline. The once chaotic energy that Helena's presence had brought now felt like a distant memory. Laura turned back to the room, where several department heads were seated around the table, their eyes fixed on her. It was a routine quarterly meeting, but something felt different. She no longer felt the need to prove herself. Flipping through the latest projections, Laura began outlining the company's next steps. Her tone was calm, assured. Leading came naturally now. We'll prioritize expanding operations in the southern regions. There's untapped potential there that we can't overlook, Laura explained, gesturing to the charts behind her. The room nodded in agreement. As the meeting concluded, Victor, one of the senior board members who had once questioned her leadership, lingered behind. You know, Victor said, adjusting his tie, I wasn't sure about you at first, but I was wrong. The company is better under your leadership. Laura offered him a small smile. I appreciate that, Victor. I just followed the foundation. My father built. Victor chuckled. Maybe. But not everyone has the strength to carry that weight. You've earned this. Laura nodded, feeling the sincerity in his words. Later that afternoon, Laura visited Roberto at home. The house felt warmer now, quieter without Helena's lingering influence. She found him in his study, reading one of the old business journals he used to pore over late into the night. You're supposed to be enjoying retirement, Laura teased, leaning against the doorframe. Roberto smiled, lowering the journal. Old habits. Laura stepped inside, taking a seat across from him. I met with the board today. Victor seems pleased with the direction we're taking. Roberto's eyes twinkled with pride. I never doubted you. Laura hesitated for a moment, her gaze softening. I couldn't have done it without you, Dad. Roberto reached across the desk, placing his hand gently over hers. You're stronger than you know, he said, quietly. And you've proven that strength to everyone. The room settled into a peaceful silence, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves outside the window. Laura felt the weight she had carried for so long finally ease. The company was thriving, her father was at peace, and for the first time the future felt open, like she was no longer chasing Helena's shadow. The soft hum of the elevator accompanied Laura as she ascended to the top floor of the office building. Months had passed since Helena's departure, and with each passing day the company flourished under her leadership. The changes she had implemented were beginning to show real results. New partnerships, stronger internal cohesion, and a reinvigorated sense of purpose among the staff. When the elevator doors opened, Laura stepped into the hallway, greeted by nods and smiles from passing employees. There was a shift in the atmosphere, one of trust and confidence. She paused for a moment outside the boardroom, her reflection faintly visible in the glass doors. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. Laura belonged here. Pushing the door open, she found Roberto already seated at the head of the table. He glanced up and smiled warmly, waving her over to the chair beside him. "You're early," Laura said, setting her bag down. "Old habits," Roberto replied with a chuckle. "Besides, I wanted to see you in action." Laura laughed softly. "I think you've seen enough." The meeting began, but this time Roberto stayed quiet, letting Laura lead the discussions. He watched as she navigated each topic with ease, addressing concerns and laying out future plans with clarity and confidence. By the end of the hour, the boardroom was filled with quiet approval. As the meeting adjourned, the directors filtered out, leaving Laura and Roberto alone once more. "You didn't say much," Laura noted, gathering her notes. Roberto leaned back in his chair, arms crossed with a content expression on his face. "I didn't need to. You've got this under control." Laura smiled. "It feels different now, easier maybe." Roberto's gaze softened. "That's because you're not fighting for it anymore. You've earned it, Laura." The weight of those words settled in Laura's chest, but instead of heaviness, there was lightness, relief. As they left the boardroom, Roberto placed his hand on her shoulder. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I used to wonder if I was holding on too tightly to the past, but now I see the company was always meant to evolve, and you're the one leading that evolution." Laura glanced at him, warmth spreading through her. "Thank you for trusting me," she replied softly. Roberto squeezed her shoulder gently. "I always have." They walked down the hallway together, side by side, no longer as just father and daughter, but as equals, each carrying the legacy forward, one step at a time. The golden light of the late afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Laura's office, casting long shadows over the polished desk. The city stretched endlessly below, but up here everything felt quiet, still. Laura stood by the window, arms crossed as she gazed out at the skyline. The office was silent, except for the faint rustle of papers behind her. Roberto sat across the room, reading through one of the company's quarterly reports with a small, satisfied smile, tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've outdone yourself," Roberto remarked without looking up. Laura turned slightly, her eyes lingering on him for a moment. "I had a good teacher." Roberto chuckled softly and set the report down. "No, Laura, you've gone beyond anything I could have taught you. This company, your company, is thriving because of you." Laura walked over to her desk, running, her fingers lightly over the old framed photo of her and Roberto from years ago, back when she had first started working at his side. "Sometimes I wonder what Mom would think," Laura said quietly, her thumb tracing the edge of the frame. Roberto's expression softened as he stood, stepping closer to join her. "She'd be proud," Roberto said, his voice warm and certain. "Not just of what you've done here, but of the person you've become." A long silence stretched between them, comfortable and unspoken. The battles had been fought, the wounds healed. Now, all that remained was the peace that followed. Laura placed the photo back on the desk, standing a little taller. "I think I'm ready," she said softly, more to herself than to Roberto. "For what?" Roberto asked, tilting his head slightly. Laura smiled, glancing back at him with quiet confidence. "For whatever comes next." A knock at the door interrupted them. Anna poked her head in, a broad smile lighting up her face. "Sorry to interrupt, but the staff is ready in the conference room. They're waiting for you." Laura exchanged a brief glance with Roberto before nodding. "We'll be right there." As Anna disappeared down the hall, Laura took a deep breath. "You coming?" she asked, turning toward Roberto. He hesitated for a moment, then shook his head with a gentle smile. "No, I think I'll sit this one out. This is your moment." Laura nodded, understanding his meaning. With one final glance around the office, the space that now felt entirely her own, Laura walked toward the door, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. As she stepped into the hallway, the murmur of voices from the conference room grew louder. Pushing open the doors, Laura was met with a round of applause. Faces of colleagues and employees she had grown to trust over the years greeted her with warmth and respect. She smiled, not because she had won, but because she knew, without a doubt, that she belonged here. This was just the beginning. Hello. Guys, if you like our stories and haven't subscribed yet, support our work and subscribe to the channel to help us.